Binyam Mohammed is back in this country after years as a prisoner at Guantanamo Bay. He protests his innocence. And one of the problems in dealing with the aftermath of the Guantanamo years is how such claims can be assessed. One of the reasons is that the detention of the inmates had, of course, none of the usual preliminaries, no charges, no court proceedings, no evidence that could be assessed independently. So how will we be able to judge Binyam Mohammed's story when it's told? Let's, first of all, before we discuss that, join our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera. I take it, Gordon, that we can expect him to lay out the whole case, as it were, that he makes for what he regards as his illegal detention fairly soon and in great detail.
Well, that's right. I think his lawyers have said that he's recovering and that at some point soon he will decide to speak to the media. And you can expect him to talk about his treatment, his claims of torture and of UK involvement in that. Although you can also expect him to be asked about what he was doing in Afghanistan and some of those questions as to how he came to be picked up in the first place.
What are we discovering as people from Guantanamo go home or turn up elsewhere? What are we discovering about those who seem to have been in there for reasons that might appear defensible, and those who were there for reasons which weren't? I mean, how is it shaping up?
Well, it's a complicated picture. There's about 520 people who've been released from Guantanamo. Now, a large number of those we simply don't have much information about. Many have simply gone back to what passes for normal life for them, for instance, those who've come back to the UK. The US has said that about 1 in 10, though, they said have become involved in some way in terrorist activities. Now, that exact description is quite controversial, because in some cases we do know people have gone from Guantanamo directly back into combat, including with the Taliban. 2 Saudi returnees recently joined the Al-Qaeda in Yemen branch. Another individual from Kuwait ended up becoming a suicide bomber in Iraq. So there are some cases like that. But other people have said, well, out of that 10%, that around 60 people, a large number actually have simply been listed as going back to the fight when all they've done is speak out against Guantanamo and against the US, and haven't actually been involved in violence. And even, for instance, with that Kuwaiti I mentioned, who became a suicide bomber in Iraq, people have looked at his biography and said, actually, there's quite strong evidence that it was Guantanamo Bay which radicalised him and turned it to violence. So it's quite a complex picture and quite difficult to pick apart.
Gordon Carrera, thanks very much. Well, look, let's discuss that with Philippe Sands, human rights lawyer, who's been very engaged in the whole Guantanamo episode. He's with us in the studio. And also Douglas Murray, director of the think tank, the Centre for Social Cohesion, was the author of Neoconservatism, Why We Need It. Douglas Murray, listening to Gordon there, I mean, it is a very complicated picture, this, isn't it?
It certainly is, and I'm not sure it's going to get any easier when Binyam Mohammed is subjected to press interview, because going on previous cases, like the case of Moazzam, the questions just weren't asked. Gordon Carrera said he'll be asked about his time in Afghanistan, but the kind of excuses that people like Binyam Mohammed and Moazzam and others have come up with have very rarely actually been investigated with any great depth by the press.
You're assuming they're excuses. I mean, you're assuming they're not true.
Well, to begin with, what we know so far of cases like Beg's and others, when people say they went to weddings on the Pakistan-Afghan border and wandered onto the wrong side of the border, or in this case, I think Binyam Mohammed has said that he went to Afghanistan to recover, I think, from a drug addiction, and had gone to the World Centre of Opium Growth to recover or to investigate that. But these cases, maybe these excuses are true, maybe they're not excuses, but they don't sound particularly convincing. They should certainly be subjected to rigorous analysis by the press, and not be taken up, may I add, as political causes by things like Stop the War Coalition and others, who parade people like Moazzam and others around university campuses up and down this country to indict the US government and our allies in the war against terror.
Philippe Sands, what do you make of that?
I think that these general allegations about particular individuals are not helpful. There's a bigger issue here, which is whether or not what we are engaged in is a war, a conflict in which you pick people up off the streets and you incarcerate them because they present a security threat in an armed conflict situation, or whether you apply the system of criminal justice. And if you apply the system of criminal justice, in this country we have a presumption of innocence, and at our peril we start playing around with that.
Do you think, Douglas Murray, that it would be proper to incarcerate people in the way that they were incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay on the basis of something close to normal court procedures?
I've always been critical of the slowness of the procedure at Guantanamo Bay. I think that it's been a huge shot in the foot by the American administration, that these trials of detainees were not sped up, didn't take place a long time ago.
Well, and if the best they can say afterwards, as Gordon Carrera was suggesting earlier, is that perhaps 1 in 10 have gone into some kind of action somewhere elsewhere in the world, whether that's resuming action or having been radicalised in Guantanamo Bay, we don't know. But if it's 1 in 10, it doesn't suggest much for the efficiency of picking up the people who are posing a threat, does it?
Well, the people who were picked up include the most senior figures in Al-Qaeda, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the planner, instigator of the 9/11 attacks. Now, Binyam Mohammed himself admitted, among other things, that he'd been to the Al-Farouk training camp where the 9/11 hijackers had also been for training. The presumption that of guilt is no great thing with these people, but people picked up on the battlefield should, I think, not have the kind of presumption of innocence and continuing innocence that many people would like to give them.
It depends on this point.
Depends what you mean by the battlefield. If the battlefield is the entire planet and you can pick up anyone off any street in any town in any country anywhere in the world, then Douglas is right. But of course that's not the battlefield. I spent a lot of time talking with the head of the Guantanamo facility when it was opened in 2002, Major General Mike Dunleavy. He told me, I've written about it, that the whole system went completely wrong right from the beginning. He received hundreds of people in February, March, April 2002. He immediately worked out that more than half the people were completely irrelevant. He went to the Pentagon and he said, let's send these people back. And the Pentagon said, no, absolutely not, we're going to hang on to them. And it went wrong because the screening process at the outset, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in other parts of the world, simply didn't follow the normal military US procedures. And that is the real reason why we've got ourselves into the mess that we're in now.
There's no doubt that people have been picked up who charges have not been able to be brought against. But we should be very wary of thinking that anyone who comes out of Guantanamo is an innocent.
We will no doubt be hearing from Binyam Mohammed and hoping to ask him questions in the days that lie ahead. Douglas Murray and Philippe Sands, thank you both very much.